My hand was already on the doorknob when his voice cracked through the hallway. "I can't do this anymore." The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit harder than a shout. I turned slowly and found Adrian standing in the frame of my tiny apartment, still in his tailored black coat. One hand braced against the wall like the room itself was the only thing keeping him upright. He looked wrong there. Too powerful for my peeling paint. Too exhausted for the man the city feared. Behind him, two of his men stayed in the stairwell, silent and rigid, and for the first time I saw them wait for his cue instead of taking one. That alone told me something had changed. This was not a visit. This was surrender. "Adrian," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was shaking inside my ribs. "If you're here to make another demand, you should go." His jaw tightened. He didn't move. He just looked at me with that same dark, controlled stare that had once made an entire restaurant go quiet. But tonight, there was no command in it. Only strain. "I'm not here to demand anything," he said. "I'm here because if you close that door, I don't know what I'll do next." My fingers curled around the knob. I should have felt victory. I should have felt safe. Instead, I felt the weight of a man standing one step from the edge of something he couldn't control. I had spent weeks cleaning his shirts, answering his calls, pretending not to notice the way his body went still whenever I walked into a room. He was the kind of man who could make a judge disappear from a case, reroute a shipment across 3 ports, silence a room with one look. But in that moment, all of that power was useless. He was not asking because he was weak. He was asking because he was scared of himself. "Say what you came to say," I told him. He let out a slow breath, like it hurt. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a plain white envelope. Not a weapon, not a threat. He held it out with 2 fingers, the way a man handles something dangerous and fragile at the same time. I didn't take it yet. He noticed. He lowered his hand. "Respect. Real respect. Inside is the deed to the building," he said. "It's yours now. No strings. No favors. No debt." I stared at him. That was the first shock. Not because of the money, but because he had chosen release over leverage. My apartment, my quiet little life, the one thing I had left that no one could buy, was suddenly mine in a way it had never been before. "Why?" I asked. He looked at the door behind me, then back at my face. "Because keeping you near me has started to feel like punishment," he said. "And I'm not cruel enough to pretend it's love if it only destroys what it touches." The room went still. Even his men outside the door stopped shifting. Adrian had just named the monster in him before I could. And somehow that made him more human, not less. I swallowed hard. "Then leave," I said, though the words came out quieter than I meant. His eyes flickered. He didn't step back. Instead, he placed the envelope on the small table beside the door, as if setting down a confession. "I tried," he said. "That's the problem." Then his gaze dropped to my hand on the doorknob. "If you open this door tonight and walk away, I will let you go." He paused, and the silence that followed felt like a gun held between us. "But if you stay one more night, Emily, I'm going to ask you for something I have no right to ask for." My breath caught. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. His whole body was saying the thing his mouth refused to name. Need. Choice. Reckoning. I looked at the envelope. Then at him. And for the first time, I saw the truth. The man who could own half the city was standing here waiting to be judged by one ordinary woman at a doorway too small for his power. I released the doorknob. Not because I was giving in. Because I wanted him to understand that if I stayed, it would be my decision. His shoulders lowered by half an inch, like something heavy had finally fallen from them. But the relief in his face vanished almost immediately, replaced by fear. Real fear. When he saw me pick up the envelope and set it back in his hand. "Keep your building," I said. "If you want me here, you don't buy my door. You tell me the truth." For a second, he didn't move. Then he closed his fingers around the envelope, looked at me like I had just changed the rules of his entire world, and said, very quietly, "Then ask me what I'm afraid of." He didn't answer right away. He stood there with the envelope in his hand, one foot still in the hall, as if he was waiting for permission to breathe. The apartment was so small that the silence between us felt louder than the traffic outside. Then he looked past me, toward the table where I had left my mug, my keys, the cheap lamp I had bought secondhand, all of it plain and stubborn in mine. "If I tell you the truth," he said, "you may decide I never deserved to be standing here." I watched his thumb tighten once over the envelope. He wasn't threatening me. That was the strange part. He looked like a man bracing for impact. Then don't make me guess, I said. That's what I've been doing already. Something in his face shifted at that. Not relief. Recognition. He stepped in only enough to close the door behind him, and with that small motion, the hallway disappeared. The city, the building, the money, all of it stayed outside. What remained was just a man who had come to my door carrying consequences. He set the envelope on the table without opening it. Before I say anything, he said, I need one promise from you. I almost laughed at that, but he didn't give me the chance. If you hear something that changes how you see me, you will not let anyone else answer for you. Not my people, not your fear, not me. It was the first time anyone had asked me for my judgment instead of my compliance, and it made my throat tighten in a way I didn't expect. You want honesty, I said. Start there. He nodded once, like he had expected nothing less, then took a slow breath and told me the building I had refused to let him buy was the last piece of land tied to his family's name. Not because he wanted more power, because his father had lost everything there trying to protect a woman who had once trusted the wrong man. He didn't say this to win sympathy. He said it because he was giving me the part of himself that was easiest to hide, the inheritance he had spent years burying under control. I didn't move. I didn't soften. I just listened. When he finished, I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands. So this wasn't about the building, I said. His jaw tightened. No, it was about whether I would become another thing you could lose. He looked at me then, fully, and the answer in his eyes was painful because it was true. Yes. The room felt smaller after that, not because he had crowded it, but because the truth had. I could see the cost of his choice now. If he stepped back, he lost the one place that could keep his family's name clean. If he stepped forward, he risked turning me into a symbol instead of a person. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then I crossed to the table, slid the envelope back toward him, and reached for my own phone instead. His eyes followed my hand, wary now, waiting for the trap. I called the property office. Not his lawyer, not his assistant. The city clerk who had answered my earlier questions and told me, in a tired voice, that the transfer was still pending. When she came on, I asked her to put the deed review on hold until I could see the original record myself. The man across from me went still. I had not chosen him. I had chosen the right to look first. And that mattered. It mattered enough that he lowered his gaze for a moment, as if the discipline of letting me do it my way had cost him something real. You don't trust me, he said quietly. Not yet, I answered. But you stayed when I asked for the truth. So don't insult me by pretending that means nothing. The corners of his mouth moved, almost a smile, but it didn't fully arrive. There was pressure in that half-breath, in the way he had to accept being ordinary in my apartment after spending a lifetime being obeyed. Then his phone rang. One look at the screen, and the last of the softness left his face. He didn't answer at first. He just watched it vibrate on the table between us like a warning. Go, I said. He shook his head once. If I go now, you'll think I chose them over you. And if you stay, they'll know I chose this. He slid the phone face down, like he was refusing a command he had lived under for too long. The movement was small, but it changed the air. It made room for me, and it made him vulnerable in a way power never could. Then he looked at my coat on the chair, the one I had worn on the day we first met, and said, very carefully, if you still want the truth tomorrow, come with me to the record office. I'll stand beside you while you read every line. It wasn't a confession. It was something harder. A surrender of control, one line at a time. I heard the risk in it immediately. If I went, I would be seen with him. If I didn't, he would have to face his people alone and let them believe I had walked away. Either choice carried a price. I took my coat from the chair and held it against my chest for a second before putting it on. Tomorrow, I said. His shoulders loosened, then tightened again when I added, but if you make one move to manage what I see, I leave. He nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. That was the new thing between us. Not trust. Not yet, but proof that trust could begin where control stopped. When he opened the door to leave, he paused on the threshold and glanced back at the apartment, at me, at the ordinary life I had refused to hand over to him. You're making this harder than I expected, he said. I locked eyes with him. Good. If it matters, it should cost you something. Then he was gone into the hallway, carrying the envelope, the inheritance, and the first real consequence of letting me judge him for myself. And for the first time since he came to my door, I knew tomorrow would not be about what he wanted. It would be about whether two people from different worlds could stand in the same room and tell the truth without hiding behind power. He closed the door behind him, but the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt watched, quiet, like the air itself was waiting to see whether I would back down. I stood at the sink with the envelope still on the table, my pulse finally slowing enough for me to think clearly. The inheritance wasn't just papers. It was a fight hidden inside legal language, the kind men like him were used to winning with a phone call and a room full of silence. So I did the one thing he probably didn't expect. I read every page. Not because I wanted control for control's sake, but because if I was going to stand beside a man who could move a city with a nod, I needed to know what he was carrying and what it would cost if I touched it. The first document was simple enough to miss if you weren't careful. A trust clause, a sealed transfer, a condition attached to one old property that had been in his family for decades. Nothing flashy, no threat, no drama, just a quiet trap waiting for a weak signature. I marked the line with my finger and felt my stomach tighten. This part, I said when he came back 15 minutes later, still in his coat. They're trying to force you into a deadline you don't have to accept. He stopped just inside the doorway. Not because he doubted me, because he was listening, really listening. I slid the paper toward him and explained the timing, the loophole, the one sentence that could be challenged if he moved too fast. He looked down, then back up at me, and something in his face shifted, not warmth exactly, but respect with a sharper edge. He had expected caution. I gave him precision. He had expected emotion. I gave him strategy. And because of that, he didn't call one of his men. He didn't take the papers from me and dismiss me into the background. He pulled out a chair across from mine and sat down like we were partners in the same room, not a man deciding whether to trust a stranger. That was the first cost. If I had a voice here, then I also had a stake here. He said my name once, low and careful, and handed me a second folder. Then help me do this right, he said. Not as an order, as a choice. The words landed harder than praise ever could. I opened the folder and found account statements, property records, and a list of names tied to the family holdings. More responsibility, more weight, more ways for me to get it wrong. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt the edge of fear, because every line I understood made it clearer. If I helped him, I wouldn't just be proving I was useful. I would be helping shape what kind of man he became when power had a chance to crush caution. And he knew that too. He watched me hesitate, then reached across the table and turned the lamp lower, softening the glare on the pages. A small thing, but it said he was willing to make room for me instead of demanding I fit inside his shadow. Outside, a car slowed in front of the building. He noticed it at the same time I did. His jaw tightened once, then steadied. They're checking on me, he said. Or on you. I looked back at the papers, then at him. Then let them see I'm still here. He didn't smile. He did something more dangerous. He believed me. And when he stood, he didn't ask me to leave the table. He asked me to keep reading while he made a call that would delay everything until morning. Not because I had solved his world, because I had changed how he moved through it. The door locked with a soft click behind him, and I understood the new shape of this thing between us. Not safety, not yet, but trust with consequences. If I stayed, I would be carrying more than his documents. I would be carrying the fact that he had let me see where the cracks were. And that meant the next time the city came for him, it would not just be testing his power. It would be testing whether he could protect what he had started to believe in. When I heard the sound of engines outside the house, I knew the morning had already stopped being ordinary. He was still at the table, one hand over the papers, the other resting near his phone like he had been holding the whole city back from the door all night. He looked at me once, not to ask if I was ready, but to make sure I understood what was coming. Stay close, he said. And if anyone questions why you're here, you let me answer. I should have let that be enough. I should have stayed behind the door, quiet and grateful, the way people expected a woman like me to be in a room like this. But the sound outside kept growing. 3 cars, maybe 4, men stepping out, voices low and sharp. A test. Not for him. For me. I felt it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he reached for nothing and still seemed more dangerous than anyone else in the house. You don't have to do this, he said. And that was the first time I understood he was giving me an exit with his words, even while his life offered me none. I looked at the papers in front of us, at the names, the dates, The places where signatures had become promises and promises had become liabilities. Then I looked back at him. If I'm going to be trusted with this, I said quietly, I need to be trusted in front of them too. His eyes held mine for a long second. Not pleased, not amused, just aware. Then he stood and moved to the window, parting the curtain by 1 inch. The council is here, he said. They think I've made a mistake. I heard what he did not say. They meant me. The front door opened before the knock came, and the man in the lead was older, dressed in charcoal and judgment, carrying the kind of authority that came from surviving longer than most men in his world. He did not look at me kindly. He looked at me like a question he had already decided to dislike. So this is her, he said. The woman who was allowed past the table. My face burned, but I kept my chin up. He had taught me that much without meaning to. She's here because she earned it, he said, and the room changed when he said it. Not softer, sharper, more dangerous. One of the men glanced at me, then at the documents, then back at him. And if she can't keep what she's seen to herself? The man asked. The air went still. This was the cinder line. One wrong breath, and I would be sent back to the world I came from, clean and invisible and safely uninvolved. He could have protected me by sending me away. Instead, he did something worse for his safety and better for my soul. He handed me the folder. Read the second page, he said. Not as a test, as an invitation. My fingers shook only once before I opened it. The numbers were real. The names were real. The problem was bigger than the room, and the weight of it hit me hard enough to make my throat tighten. I understood then why he had kept me at the edge of his world before now. This was not glamour. This was responsibility with a pulse. I looked up from the page and met the council's eyes one by one. This agreement can't stand, I said, hearing my own voice steady in a way I had never heard before. Not if you want the city calm by sunrise. One of them smiled without warmth. And what do you know about that? He didn't answer for me. He let me answer for myself. That was the risk. That was the gift. Enough to know where it breaks, I said. Silence spread. Then, unexpectedly, he moved beside me, not in front. Beside. A shared line. A shared burden. She's right, he said. It was small. It was enormous. Because in his world, agreeing with me in front of them meant more than approval. It meant consequence. It meant choosing me where everyone could see. The oldest man exhaled through his nose, clearly displeased, and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Then prove it by dawn, he said, or the city will decide you were both wrong. When they left, the house felt larger and less safe at the same time. He closed the door slowly, then rested a hand on the back of the chair I had not asked to sit in. You just made yourself visible, he said. I swallowed. I know. That means they'll come for your judgment as much as mine. I know that too. He watched me for a long moment, and something in his expression finally slipped. Not weakness, not even tenderness. Something rarer. Respect with fear inside it. Then don't ask to be protected from what comes next, he said. Ask to stand through it. I took the folder, felt its weight settle into my hands like a second heartbeat, and nodded once. The old door behind me was already closing in my mind. Whatever came with dawn would not be his alone anymore. It would be ours. I set the folder on the table, but I didn't open it right away. For a second, the room stayed still except for the clock and the low hum of the city outside. He was watching me like he was waiting for me to flinch, to ask for an easier version of the truth. I didn't. I slid the chair back and sat where he had left me a place, even though my hands were shaking under the table. That choice felt small. It wasn't. Outside, a car door slammed, then another. Somewhere below us, men were moving into position, and the house seemed to inhale and hold its breath. He looked toward the window, then back at me. They came early, he said. I nodded, and that was when it hit me. All the times he had stepped into danger with me standing behind him weren't kindness. They were restraint. He had been carrying the weight of every room, every name, every threat, and still he had made room for my fear first. I remembered his hand on the chair, not as a claim, but as an invitation. I remembered the respect in his eyes with fear folded inside it. It changed the shape of everything. He wasn't asking me to stay because he needed something from me. He was asking because he was finally willing to be seen needing anyone at all. The realization landed hard enough to hurt. If I stayed hidden, he could keep carrying it alone. If I stepped forward, I became part of the risk. That was the cost. I reached for the folder and opened it. The papers inside were simple, and ugly and final. Names, dates, decisions already made by people who would never have to live with them. My throat tightened when I understood what he had brought me here for. Not protection, partnership, a chance to see the machinery before it moved over us. He stayed silent while I read, and that silence was louder than any promise. When I looked up, his face had changed. Not softer, stronger in a more fragile way. Like he had decided not to hide the part of himself that could still be broken. If you walk into this with me, he said, there's no clean way back out. My pulse kicked once hard. Clean was the old life. Clean was being chosen for, not choosing. Clean was pretending love could exist without consequence. I stood, and the chair legs scraped the floor. The sound echoed through the room like a door locking. I took the folder and held it to my chest. Then don't ask me to be safe, I said. Ask me to stay honest. His eyes held mine, and in that second I saw the price he had been paying for every second he stood still around me. He had been giving me the last of his control, the one thing men like him were never supposed to surrender. He crossed the room slowly, not like a boss, not like a man used to being obeyed, but like someone approaching a vow he could not take back once spoken. When he stopped in front of me, he didn't touch me. That restraint was its own kind of sacrifice. Then when they asked, he said, "You tell the truth." I understood what he meant. Not the convenient truth. Not the version that would keep me safe. The one that would tie my name to his and make me responsible for what came next. I nodded once. Irreversible. That was the only word for it. Somewhere below, the first voices rose at the front gate, sharp and impatient. He turned toward the sound, then looked back at me one last time, and the expression in his face was no longer fear of losing control. It was the fear of trusting me with it. I followed him to the door, and when he opened it, I stepped through beside him, not behind him. That was the first price of saying yes. And the city was already coming to collect. I didn't get a second to become used to the silence. The front gate was already sounding with voices, boots, and the hard metallic rattle of men who had come expecting control. I stood beside him at the door, my fingers cold around the hem of my sleeve, and he looked at me once as if he were measuring the distance between who I had been 5 minutes ago and who I had to be now. "Stay behind me," he said. "Not an order. A test." I shook my head. If I hid then, I would become a secret again. If I stepped forward, I would become a choice. So I moved to his side instead. The hallway light cut across his face in a pale strip, and for one breath he looked less like a man feared by the city and more like someone carrying too many consequences in one body. When the first bodyguard shouted from below that the family was demanding answers, his jaw tightened. He didn't reach for the gun at his back. He reached for my hand. That single motion changed the air between us. It was not protection. It was permission. He was telling them, before he ever spoke, that whatever came next would include me. We went down together. Every step felt louder than the last. At the landing, the men waiting in the foyer turned toward us like a wall deciding whether to open or crush. His mother stood near the marble table, face rigid, one hand locked around a rosary she had not been touching when we left the room. She did not ask if I was worthy. She asked the question that mattered more. "Do you understand what this means?" The room went still. I did. I understood that the word yes was no longer private. It had become a contract with his bloodline, his enemies, and every consequence that followed his name. I also understood that if I lied now, I would let him carry the cost alone. If I told the truth, I would be stepping into the line of fire on purpose. So I lifted my chin and said, "Yes." It was a small word. It landed like a breach. His mother closed her eyes for a moment, not in approval, but in mourning for the softer life I had just given up. One of the men at the door let out a short, humorless laugh, and that was enough for him. My man turned his head slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with it. "She speaks for herself," he said. "If you want her, you answer to me." No threat, no flourish, just the kind of sentence that closes doors. The men outside shifted, but the woman beside the table took a step forward and put both hands flat on the marble as if steadying the entire house. "Then the council will want to meet tonight," she said. "If she is choosing this, they will make her prove she understands the burden." I felt his grip tighten around my fingers. That was the cost arriving early. Not a celebration, not a promise, but a test designed to expose whether I was only brave in private. He looked at me, and I saw the choice he was not allowed to say aloud. He could shield me from the room by sending me upstairs, which would save me for an hour and make me smaller forever. Or he could let me stay, which would expose me to every measuring eye in the house and prove that I belonged in the truth, not just in his protection. He chose the harder thing. He kept my hand in his and faced the room with me. Then meet her, he said. And understand this. If you force her to bleed for my name, you will answer for every drop. The words hit the foyer like a slammed vault. For one brief second, I thought that was the point of no return. But it was not the threat that made it final. It was what he did next. He placed the ring on my finger in front of them all. Not as a performance, as a surrender of deniability. The house could no longer pretend I was temporary. The council could no longer treat me as a passing weakness. And I could no longer step back without becoming the one who broke the vow. The old safety was gone. In its place was responsibility sharp enough to cut. A messenger came through the gate then, breathless, and handed him a folded card with no return name. He read it once, and the line of his mouth hardened. He turned the card toward me so I could see the address written inside. It was mine. My old apartment. They were there tonight, he said quietly, watching for you before we ever came down. I felt my stomach drop, because that meant the cost had not started with my yes. It had only been waiting for it. And when he looked back at the front door, I knew the next move would not be about hiding me anymore. It would be about deciding what, exactly, we were willing to lose first. The silence after that message was worse than shouting. I stood in the front hall with the card still warm in his hand, watching the color drain from his face as if the address had reached into him and taken something old and fragile with it. Then he folded the card once, slowly, and slipped it into his pocket like it was dangerous to let anyone else see. You need to stay inside, he said. Not as an order, as a plea he was trying to disguise. I heard it anyway. I looked past him, through the glass doors, to the dark line of trees and the gate beyond them. Outside, the city kept breathing like nothing had happened. Inside, everything had changed. If they know where I live, I said, and my own voice shook, then they know where I am. His jaw tightened. For 1 second, he looked exactly like the man the city feared. Not because he was cruel, because he was already calculating how much of the world he would burn to keep me safe. He stepped closer, then stopped himself before touching me, like even that comfort cost something now. I should move you somewhere else tonight, he said. Somewhere no one can find. The words landed between us with the weight of a goodbye he did not want to name. I felt it immediately, the terrible shape of the choice. If I let him hide me again, I would be safe, but I would be a secret. If I stayed, I would be seen, and being seen meant becoming a target. Neither option felt like living. I took the card from his hand and read my old address again, and then the number on the back. A time. 11:30. A meeting I had never agreed to. My throat tightened. They want me to come alone, I whispered. No, he said at once. Sharp. Protective. Instinctive. Then quieter. They want to make you choose. That was what made my chest hurt. Not the threat. The fact that they understood us well enough to use the one thing we had finally built, my right to decide. His right to trust that decision. The house lights hummed overhead. Somewhere deeper inside, a door shut. I realized with a cold wave of dread that if I asked him to go with me, I would be asking him to turn his power into a cage for me again. And if I told him to stay behind, I would be walking into the dark without the one person who could end it before it started. He saw the answer forming on my face and shook his head once. Don't do this alone. I'm not, I said, and hated how small it sounded, because it was true and not true at the same time. I reached for his hand before I could stop myself. His fingers closed around mine immediately, hard enough to hurt, like he needed the proof that I was still here. If I go, I said, you do not take that choice away from me. His eyes lifted to mine. I saw the war there. The old man would have refused. The man standing in front of me swallowed, then nodded once. One nod. A surrender. A promise. And somehow that was the most dangerous thing he had ever given me. Because it meant he was trusting me with a kind of freedom that could cost him everything. He let go of my hand first. That tiny release felt louder than a gunshot. He crossed to the side table, picked up the burner phone, and typed a single message with his thumb. I could not see the screen, only the hard set of his shoulders as he sent it. When he turned back, his expression had changed. Not calmer, clearer. If you walk into that address, he said, I can't guarantee what I'll find there. I nodded, though my pulse was pounding too hard to think. Then his phone vibrated almost instantly. He looked down. His face went still. Too still. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen as if the words there had reached into his chest and taken the last clean piece of air with them. Finally, he looked up at me. The fear in his eyes was not for himself. It was for me. "They already took someone from the apartment," he said. "And if we leave now, we may still be in time to decide who they used to bring you there." The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, and the sound that hit me first was not gunfire. It was crying. A child's thin, broken crying, tangled with the low voices of men trying to sound calm and failing. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like I had missed a step on a staircase that wasn't there. He moved in front of me at once, one hand lifting like a shield across my chest, not touching, just blocking the worst of the sight before I could take it in all at once. The hall outside the apartment was lit by a single flickering lamp, and the walls still smelled faintly of smoke and dust. One door hung half open. Another had been kicked in. I saw a tiny sneaker by the threshold and went cold. "Stay behind me," he said, but his voice was different now. Not hard. Controlled. The kind of control that cost something. I stepped around him anyway, because the crying had already told me too much. Inside, the apartment was ruined in the way only fear can ruin a place. A lamp on its side. A chair broken in half. A family photo face down on the floor. And in the corner, clutching a gray stuffed rabbit to her chest, was the little girl from the building downstairs, the one who had always waved at me when I carried groceries in after work. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. Her mother was kneeling beside her, shaking so badly she could barely breathe. The men who had brought us here were gone. That made the silence worse. I knelt slowly, like any sudden movement might shatter what was left of the room. The little girl looked up at me with wet, frightened eyes. "He said if I kept crying, they would take Mama too," she whispered. The words landed like a blade under my ribs. I felt his presence behind me go still. Not angry, not impatient, just stripped down to the one thing in him that had survived every room he had ever entered. He looked at the mother, then at the child, then at me. And for the first time since I had met him, I saw what his power had always been trying to hide. Not ownership, not force, but fear of arriving too late. He pulled out his phone, spoke one short order, and every man in the apartment seemed to straighten as if they had been waiting their whole lives for him to choose mercy instead of punishment. Then he crouched beside the little girl, careful, almost reverent, and held out the stuffed rabbit he had found near the broken chair. It had a torn seam at the ear. He pressed his thumb over it, then looked at me as if he understood something he had not understood before. "You fix what gets broken," he said quietly. "I protect what I should have reached sooner." My throat tightened, because I realized then that the title was never only about a man with power deciding to keep a woman. It was about the moment power became responsible enough to kneel. He had crossed an entire city to get to an address. But this was the real arrival, not at the apartment, but at the truth of what he was willing to become for the people I could not save alone. He handed the rabbit back to the child, then turned to the mother and told her, in a voice that left no room for fear, that no one would touch them again tonight. Not because he was a boss, because he was here, because he had finally chosen to be seen using his strength for something that could not pay him back. The mother cried harder then, not from terror this time, but from relief so sharp it looked almost like pain. I reached for the girl's small hand, and she took mine without hesitation. In that tiny grip, I felt the last wall between his world and mine change shape. Not disappear. Change. He looked at our joined hands for a long second, then at me, and I understood the question he wasn't asking out loud. After all this, after everything he had done and everything he had failed to do, was I still willing to stand beside the man who had learned mercy too late? But honestly, the child's tears had stopped. Mine had not. But when I rose, he did not take my hand. He waited for me to give it. He finally let go of the old rules that had kept him untouchable, and for the first time in my life, I saw power kneel into something gentler. The men in the room had already stepped back. No one spoke. No one needed to. The girl stood close to her mother now, her small fingers still wrapped around mine, her breathing steady at last. He looked at her, then at me, and slowly reached into his coat. I thought, for one brief second, that he was reaching for control, for a weapon, for the kind of answer a man like him had spent years making the world expect. Instead, he took out a plain black card with no name on it and set it on the table between us. "If you ever need anything," he said to the mother, his voice quiet enough to feel like a promise instead of a threat, "call that number. No questions. No debt." The mother stared at him like she did not know how to receive mercy from a man with blood on his reputation and grief in his eyes. Then she nodded once, and that single movement seemed to cost her something and give her something back at the same time. I knew then that this was what he had meant when he said he wanted to be better, not louder, not softer for show, better in the only way that mattered, with proof. He turned to me next, and I felt the whole room hold its breath. My hand was still in the little girl's, and I did not let go when he stepped closer. That mattered, maybe more than anything else, because once I would have lowered my eyes around him. Once I would have waited to be chosen, but not anymore. He didn't ask me to come with him. He didn't claim me. He just stood there until I understood that the choice was mine, and the silence between us had changed from a wall into a door. I looked at the child first, then at the mother, then at him, and I realized he was waiting not for obedience, but for consent. For the first time, the man who had once ruled a city was asking for nothing he could take. "I'll walk out with you," I said at last, because I wanted to, not because I was afraid not to. His face changed so quickly it almost hurt to witness it. Relief. Gratitude. Something older underneath both of those things. Something like the ghost of a man he had been before the city taught him how to disappear his heart. He did not touch me. He only opened the door. Outside, the rain had eased to a silver mist, and the streetlights made the wet pavement shine like a path laid down for a different life. We stepped out together, but not as owner and possession, not as savior and saved. As two people who had both paid too much to arrive at the same truth. The little girl tugged my sleeve before we reached the curb and slipped something into my palm. It was her paper bracelet from the hospital, folded carefully into a tiny circle. "So you remember me," she whispered. I swallowed hard and closed my fingers around it. Behind us, I heard him tell one of his men to send the car away. Not for show, not because he no longer needed it, because he had decided, for one night, that being seen walking beside us was worth more than being feared arriving for us. The sound of the engine fading into the distance felt like an old world leaving. The mother put an arm around her daughter. I took the child's other hand. He noticed, and this time his expression didn't harden. It softened, not into weakness, into peace. We crossed the street slowly, for shadows moving together under the rain-bright lights, and I understood that legacy was never the empire behind him. It was this, a child who would grow up knowing power could protect without owning. A mother who would remember that help did not always come with chains, and a man who finally learned that the greatest thing he could ever offer was not his name, but his restraint. At the far corner, the girl let go of my hand and ran ahead to her mother, laughing for the first time that night. I stayed where I was and watched him watch them go. Then, very quietly, he held out his hand to me one last time. Not to pull, not to claim, only to meet mine if I still chose it. I placed my fingers in his, and we stood there beneath the rain, neither of us trying to own the moment, only to remember it.